Hello and welcome to this middle game strategy video, and today I'll be discussing what side of the chessboard should you play on. And in this series I pick some famous chess masters, the greatest of all time, and we go over some of their games and see what we can learn about strategy. So today I have Jose Capablanca, but this game happened in 1901 in Havana, Cuba, and Capablanca was only about 12 years old at the time of this tournament game. And so he still wasn't the force that he would become later when he went on to become the third world chess champion. There are some mistakes as he's still improving his game. So let's see what happened here and what we can learn. The game did go on to a draw. I'll just get that out of the way. But there's a lot we can learn. Look how the game kind of moved up and down. Capablanca was, almost pretty much winning earlier in the game, until it fizzled out, and then he was winning at the end almost until it ended in the draw. Okay, let's begin here. I'll pull up the computer analysis, and the game begins with d4 by Capablanca, and we have d5, so queen pawn opening. They both take the center with those pawns, and now e3 is played, and you don't see this as often, but we'll see why he played this. He's going for the collie opening, so the game continues with knight developing. So now we have bishop. And this is interesting because usually you want to bring your knights out before your bishops because the knights are slower, and the knights are almost always well placed on f3 or f6 like this. But the knight will make it there eventually. So immediately we have a strike in the center. Now here we have d4 and d5 being played, and usually in those openings the center gets kind of locked and play must occur on the flanks. So that's what black does here. Now this pawn is not protected, so white could capture that, but then it pulls his valuable central pawn off to the side, and black will have a little bit more control of the center. And once this pawn pushes forward, there'll be a discovered attack on that pawn. So Capablanca ignores that. He plays b3, and so this move does a couple things. It allows the bishop to develop, which will line up through the center towards black's king side, so that could be a valuable bishop later in the game. And this b3 pawn move discourages this pawn push chasing the bishop. So now we have more developing moves. So this is, normal play. You get the knights out before the bishops usually, and they're both, almost always very well placed on c6 or f6 here. So Capablanca continues with his bishops. Now remember, he's 12 at this time and he's still improving. And, maybe he learned later that normally you want to bring your knights out before you get those bishops moving. But in this opening, even though it says queen's pawn opening stonewall attack, it transposes into the Colley-Zukertort variation, or here I think they call it the Rubinstein variation. So the game continues with e6, an inaccuracy according to the computer. If the flank pawn captured the central pawn on d4, the computer would like that a little bit better. So Capablanca finally develops his knight and he's ready to castle. We have a queen developing move, which normally you don't want to bring your queen out too early, but this is kind of adding pressure here. Also, there's a threat of now pushing this pawn, and you can't capture with the pawn or the queen would be able to take that bishop. So the game continues with the knight developing. And so we do have this attack on the bishop. And remember, the pawn cannot capture, or the queen would capture the dark squared bishop. So we have bishop retreating, the best move in the position. At this point, white has a slight edge. So the game continues with capturing of the pawn, although instead the computer likes a5, that pawn push, gaining more space on the queen side. Now, finally, we're getting out of the opening here. I'll play a few more moves and then we can discuss how you figure out what side of the chessboard you should be playing on. So bishop is developed here in the center where it covers both of these diagonals, and castling by both sides. And we're almost out of the opening here and heading into the middle game. All right, so here is how you decide what side of the board to play on. Now, there's a couple different factors you have to consider. If your opponent leaves their king wide open, well, you might want to definitely play on that side of the board and maybe get an attack in. But if not, a great piece of strategy is to look at what direction your pawns are pointing. So, and mainly your central pawns. Both sides have their central pawns pointing towards the queen side here. So we see how both sides are kind of funneling their pieces and pawns towards the queen side. And a good piece of strategy is, if you have this pawn chain aimed up towards the queen side, then you might want to push the next pawn. And here there's even a threat of pushing that pawn further and forking the bishop and the queen here. So, what will the response be? Well, the best move was found, bringing that bishop forward. And, that can be a great piece of middle game strategy, is to get your pieces on your opponent's side of the board where they can start attacking. And on the other side of that, if your opponent is placing pieces on your side of the board, your half of the board here, often you want to try and get rid of those, trade them off or attack them so they have to retreat. So the game continues with bishop developing here. And often you don't want to move pieces twice, unless you have a good idea or a good reason behind it. So that is what, and I should clarify, in the opening, you don't want to move pieces twice until you get all your pieces off the back rank and your rooks developed. Now, there's always exceptions. So here, because this bishop moved again, Capablanca decided to move his bishop again. And, remember, it's kind of a race to get all your pieces developed and see if you can develop them faster than your opponent can. So the game continues with bishop developing. We have the queen developing. And now here the computer prefers queen to e2 and says that would give a bigger advantage. But perhaps the queen wanted to move over here and help guard the bishop. Also, there might be a possibility of, along with a rook, grabbing this open file in the future. So the game continues with the rook developing here on the half open file at the moment. But another piece, great piece of strategy in general, not only in the middle game, but, the end game and opening as well, is to line up one of your less valuable pieces with a more valuable piece. So here the rook lines up on that queen. Even though there's a pawn and a knight in between, you never know when things might open up and there could be a discovered attack on that queen. So the game continues with the knight grabbing this outpost. Now, that's usually a good piece of middle game strategy, is to go ahead and place a knight on a square where a pawn cannot attack it. Now, if this knight moves out of the way on f6, it could be attacked in the future. But for the moment, that knight's on a pretty good square. And it has, well, I shouldn't say a threat yet. It's threatening to get rid of the bishop pair. And that can be a great strategy in the middle game, is to try and get rid of one of your opponent's bishops, especially if the position looks like it's going to be open. If you have a really closed position, knights could be more valuable because they can jump over the clustered pawns. So, what do we have here? The knight is threatening that bishop, so that is ignored for the moment in favor of a capture, so voluntarily giving up the bishop pair, and that is if that bishop is captured, and of course it is. So the best move found by Capablanca. At this point, white has a little bit more than a +1 advantage, and even after this pawn is captured, now black is ahead in material, but it's almost a losing mistake here. So why is this such a mistake? Well, it looks like there's a possibility of attacking the rook here. And then if they try to save that rook, there's a possibility of moving here, attacking the queen and getting some counterplay. And the computer, seems to think that that's almost winning. But in the game, that was not found by the young Capablanca. Instead, he pushes this pawn. And another good piece of middle game strategy, or even in the opening, is really think hard before you relieve the tension between pawns in the center. These two pawns were attacking one another, and now the tension has been relieved. So that's less for black to constantly think about, about whether or not white's pawn is going to capture there. But maybe Capablanca didn't like the possibility of black capturing and then attacking his bishop there. So he pushes the pawn. Now we have a rook being centralized. That is a missed opportunity. Apparently, knight takes e5 was the way to go. But then that would allow a recapture, and this knight would be chased. Where would it go? Probably forward. So the game continues with a brilliant move by Capablanca. What is happening here? The queen is under attack, and now this bishop is not protected. But if that bishop is captured, well, then you could have maybe an attack on the queen there, and that's not looking too good. So the game continues with this knight developing to the outpost here. But at this point, the bishop could capture. That would give up the bishop pair. Also, the pawn could attack. So let's see what happens. And also, the knight, of course, is attacking the queen. So we have the queen just dropping back, and the computer really likes that move. Now we have a queen retreat, as it was under attack by that bishop, of course. So the game continues with a move to chase away that knight. Now, that seems like a decent move, but it's a missed opportunity. Once again, what I was saying about pieces that make it onto your side of the board, you really have to keep an eye on those, and think about getting rid of those pieces, knocking them out, chasing them away, getting them out of your territory. So here, what would have been best? It looks like it would have been better to just take the other bishop, apparently, getting rid of that bishop. But instead, we have the knight under attack. Knight captures knight here. And that is ignored, and that's, a possible strategy. at any parts of the game is look at what your opponent is doing. And if they have a threat or an attack, maybe you have a more powerful counterattack. So you try and dictate the course of the game. But here it looks like what would have been better? Capturing this knight. The computer likes that move better. So the game continues with a queen attack here, jumping forward, attacking our queen. Computer doesn't like that. What is recommended? Queen to c4 instead. Just moving over here, lining up on the opponent's queen. So if that bishop moves, there could be a queen trade. So the game continues with capture of the knight. Queens are traded. The bishop drops back, the best move in the position. And the game continues with a knight repositioning move. Now maybe there's a threat to attack the bishop. What else could be happening here? Maybe this pawn captures, that one threatens to push forward. Different options at work here. So capture, recapture. Bishop is developed here. Lining up on the knight and bishop. So the game kind of wraps up here with the pawn push. And now we have just some maneuvering. Okay, remember, if you have the bishop pair, usually it's better to have the board, kind of open. Here, the center is kind of closed up a little bit, but the bishop pair can be a pretty good advantage. So Capablanca starts trying to maneuver his bishops around. This move gives him the opportunity to capture. So he ignores that in favor of lining up on this unprotected pawn. And so now we have capture, recapture. And if we notice, these pawns are pointing to the queen side, and that's where Capablanca is playing. So, once again, if you're trying to figure out which side of the board you should be playing on, look at the direction that your central pawns are aimed, and that can give you a little bit of a clue on which way to go. Now, remember, there's always exceptions, but in general, you want to attack towards the direction that your pawns are aimed. Why? Well, because if the pawns are pointed up in this direction, you'll probably have more room in that direction and more space to maneuver your pieces over there. So the rooks double up, attacking this target. We have a defensive move, and so the game continues with Capablanca kind of choking off his opponent, preventing any future pawn moves. He fixes these pawns on, well, at least the B pawn, and then this one can't move forward, of course, or the bishop will just capture it. So we have the knight jumping forward, and now the king is activated. So we're kind of out of the middle game heading, well, I guess we're in the end game now. But remember, even in the middle game, but mainly in the end game, you want to try and use your king if you can, except be careful. If queens are still on the board, you don't want to get your king out there too exposed where the queen can put it in danger. All right, the pawn pushes forward here, and we see almost a pawn majority here of three pawns versus these two. And often it's a good strategy to push the pawn, the unopposed pawn, although this pawn is doing a good job of slowing it down there. But, even if that pawn continues to push forward and you capture, well, then it might activate the knight if he captures that. So what does Capablanca do? He counterattacks over here, trying to slow down any future pawn pushes, and maybe to gain space. So we have the rook once again lining up on the more valuable king there, even though a pawn is in between, and maybe with a future idea of pushing that pawn. So the game continues with that king getting even more involved here, although they prefer h5, just gaining more space and kind of discouraging the pawns from pushing forward. So Capablanca's opponent, he just starts pressing forward here. And how will the game continue? Well, we have the bishop maneuvering over here to help defend. That way this pawn could be captured. The computer doesn't like that. Once again, it prefers this h5 move, just gaining more space. So we have capture, king captures, and the knight drops back here. Maybe with the threat of the fork. But the computer doesn't like that. It prefers h5 to equalize the space on the king side. And also that would place the pawn here on the light squares. And that's a good piece of strategy sometimes, is to place your pawns on the opposite colored squares of the bishop. That way this bishop cannot target them. So here we have a missed opportunity. King to d3 was preferred by the computer because now there is this fork available. So sure enough, that's what is played. But apparently that wasn't the best move. It was better to go back here and target the bishop. So the game continues with the king stepping to the side. We have a capture of a pawn. And now Capablanca's opponent is ahead by 2 pawns. So how will Capablanca pull out the draw here? Well, he plays this, which apparently is a mistake. What do they recommend? Apparently, rook to d6 is preferred, targeting this pawn, and also maybe threatening to jump up to the back rank. So here, what is the idea behind this? Well, there's a discovered attack on the rook. So also, if you capture, you have this possibility. Moving up here, if they block, then you would be able to pick that other rook off. And, with pawns on both sides of the board, well, although the knight probably would be able to capture that. All right, let's wrap this up. The rook drops back to the back rank to avoid any back rank attacks. And now there is a threat of capture here. So apparently the computer likes that capture move. So let's take a look at it. If they capture here, well, then you have rook to b8, rook to f8. And now the bishop can capture and defend. Or you could just go ahead and capture. But this apparently is the best move. Capture, capture. And now the knight could go after that. But the problem is, maybe he can't because this pawn will start pushing up the board and the king has to kind of get over here, try and stop that. So apparently knight to f5 would be the best move. And it says black would have the edge here. All right, back to the game. Let's wrap it up. The rook drops back here, helping defend the back rank. So now we have, instead of, well, of course you couldn't capture, or this rook would have recaptured. So now both rooks are targeting this pawn, and the pawn cannot step forward. So capture, capture, and that knight is trying to harass the king. So the king attacks, although it is defended. So an inaccuracy here. Apparently king to d2 would have been a better move. So now we have capture, capture, and if we look at the position, black is ahead by 1 pawn. There is this dangerous passed pawn here, but then black has 2 passed pawns over here on the king side. So we continue with the bishop dropping back. The rook is lining up in front of that passed pawn. So a good piece of strategy is to blockade any passed pawns. You know, maybe it would have been better. Well, I don't know. If you tried to move here and attack the rook, it could have maybe gone here. Anyway, the rook is trying to move in front of the passed pawn. So we continue with a counterattack on this pawn. And now possible rook trade. Capablanca avoids that, attacking the knight. The knight checks. And now we have a missed opportunity attacking here. King to f4 apparently is a little bit better. So I'll finish this out. Now, another piece of strategy is to place your bishop where it covers a lot of the squares, you know, that are possible for the knight to go to. Now, another option might have been to move way down here, covering all these squares. But, you know, maybe there could be a possible threat with that bishop all the way down there. And here, the bishop, once again, the less valuable piece is lining up on that more valuable king. And there's a possible pawn push in the future, attacking the king. So we have the rook moving forward. That pawn jumps ahead anyway. But apparently this is where they agreed to a draw. What would have been best? Computer likes king to f5, getting that king involved. You know, maybe trying to move up here and target this pawn. So now, at this point, it looks like white would be almost winning. After what happened in the game, why is this a draw? It looks like the only move that keeps it, you know, close is this, heading towards that passed pawn. And then what? Rook to e7 check, or activate the king even more, you know, with something like this. If rook captures, now you have rook to e7 check, king to d8, getting in front of the passed pawn. Now you start picking these pawns off. And the game is, you know, pretty much a draw here. It looks like white will be able to knock this pawn out. You know, or maybe even go after this one. So what other options could have occurred? If we go there, what is another option? Rook to e7. So that's a possibility, but then you just have king to d8 and you attack again, but the king has to go back. Now what? It looks like no matter what, you know, that king is going to have to get involved. All right, I'll wrap this up. So, you know, what side of the chessboard should you play on? Well, it depends on a couple different factors. If your opponent's king is vulnerable or they have some weakness, you know, that might dictate where you play. But if the game is pretty even and not much is happening, and you look at the central pawns, the direction that they point in can give you a good clue on where to play, because you might have more space in that area where your pawns are pointed. So just remember that. Hopefully it helps you. Also, feel free to leave comments. I always enjoy hearing from viewers. You can leave a request if there's something you would like to see in future videos. Also, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.